Thank you. So, maybe also to say something, I'm picking up where Joanna Bryson started, so from Wolfgang's presentation, that's sort of where I pick up and my starting point. So I should also say too that in the last 10 or 11 years or so, I've been working at uncovering and revealing the ethical issues related to robotics and artificial intelligence, mostly just robotics. And only in the last year or so, now I'm trying to take a step beyond that and to look at problem solving or solutions. So rather than just uncovering all of the problems, now what are we gonna do about it? Because some of these are actually quite immediate. And so in that context, I'm working with this concept called responsible robotics. And in the next 19 minutes, what I'd like to do is unpack what I actually mean when I say something like responsible robotics. The first part is that it's bridging between the field of ethics, between law and engineering. And mostly what I found is that working in the field of robot ethics, there's so many wonderful analyses happening, but they don't go very far beyond the walls of ethics or beyond the walls of academia. So how can we take this research out and use that to stimulate policymaking as well as new types of design, having an impact in the engineering space? But to sort of roll it back, what is it? What are these issues, these original issues that I was talking about that I think it's important we have some problem solving towards? It's important to understand the complexity of these issues, that there's different levels of uncertainty when we're talking about the consequences of these issues. We have knowns, we have issues that we understand the problem, we don't have a solution, but we understand the problem. We have known unknowns. We have a sense that there is going to be a problem, but we have no idea how big the problem will be or who's going to be impacted. And then we have unknown unknowns, things that we haven't even started to think about yet. Some of the examples of knowns, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Hello Barbie, but we have privacy issues when we're talking about AI-powered robot toys, for example. Security of the privacy, security of data, who's collecting the data, and so on and so forth. The ability to hack these toys, if you will. The home care robots is another example of this. What is happening to the data? We know there are privacy issues, but we don't necessarily know what to do about them. E-waste, huge problem. Recycling of electronic materials. We know that the sister to the robot is the PC or the smartphone, and we have not figured out how to actually recycle these materials. We ship them off to other countries, and this is what our e-waste situation looks like. We know we have a problem with robots. We don't know what to do to solve it. And then we get into some of these known unknowns, right? The idea of informed consent or getting consent when you're talking about doing robotics experimentation or interacting with robots. We know there's an issue there, but we don't necessarily know the depth of the issue. And what does it mean to give consent if we don't understand the long-term interactions of interacting with a robot, or the long-term implications, of interacting with a robot? We know that there is a problem in terms of the workforce, that the workforce of the future is going to change when robots and automation are introduced into this space, but we don't quite understand the complexity of this. We know that new jobs will be created. At the same time, those new jobs are going to be in the STEM areas, and we already know that there's a difference between the workforce in these STEM areas. What are we going to do about it? And then, the issues go on and on. We can get into some of the unknown unknowns. So companion or intimate robots was already raised. We know that there's going to be some issues, but what we aren't even scratching the surface yet. Robots in education, chatbots, having these sort of personal digital assistants. And other examples of unknown unknowns. So the idea of, this is meant to be a funny scenario, but then at the same time you think, oh geez, is that actually where we're going? That we could be in a situation where cars are interacting with each other and we have no idea what's going on with this interaction. So the black box idea. So this leaves me, all of these different levels of uncertainty and these unknowns. We know that there's problems. Well, what can we do about it? And this is where the concept of responsible robotics is meant to come in, trying to take some concrete action. So this gets into, well, what is it? What am I actually trying to talk about here? The first thing is that it requires a kind of paradigm shift in our thinking. Rather than just focusing on what can we do with robotics or what can robotics do for us, it requires that we shift this and look into what should robotics be doing for us. And it seems like, a nuanced change to the question, but it can actually be quite powerful. You know, we can make AI-driven robotic toys. Sure, we can do that, but is that where we should really be putting our resources, our time, our money, our efforts? Then when we look at unpacking this concept of responsibility, you know, it's become sort of in vogue lately, at least in my own echo chamber. Responsible robotics and innovation is something that's very much talked about within the European Commission and in the Dutch context. Value-sensitive design is, but what do these things really mean? Well, we can look at responsibility and we can understand it in the descriptive sense. So looking for causal relationships. How can we sort of identify an actor as responsible for something? We can also look at it in the normative sense, and this is what Wolfgang was also talking about as well. How can we attribute praise or blame to an entity, to an agent, most times? Responsible robotics is concerned with both of these, right? We have to do the causal in order to understand the normative dimension, but its focus is much more on the normative. Where can we attribute praise, blame, and obligation? We can also consider responsibility in the temporal sense. We have backward-looking responsibility, so you look at actions that happened in the past, and then you assume or project liability, or you say you were responsible for that action. Or we can have forward-looking. We can anticipate that consequences, negative consequences, will happen in the future. So you have an obligation to do something about that, to change the state of affairs so that doesn't happen. So there's this temporal dimension as well. Now, with responsible robotics, depending on the level of uncertainty, that will impact whether or not it's backward-looking or forward-looking. If it's these known unknowns, and we don't really understand all of the consequences, we need to be much more forward-looking to try and anticipate, to try and uncover what is it that's going to happen in the future. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. The other part of this phrase, responsible robotics, well, what is robotics? And here an important distinction is that between the robot and robotics. So robot comes from the Czech playwright. Rossum's Universal Robot is the name of the play, and robot is meant, you know, as servant to a human. It's usually referring to one sort of prototype or entity. Robotics, Isaac Asimov coined that term, that is the study of robots. So it's looking at the design, the development, the use, the regulation. It is the entire life cycle of robots, qua robots, right? And what's also important is that because we're talking about the study of, the making of, the development of, it means we are not talking about the robot as being a responsible agent. We're talking about the humans bearing all responsibility in this discussion. So that's where I make the relationship with Joanna Bryson and her work, that she talks about the humans always being responsible, and therefore it's those actions that we need to evaluate and assess. So we're getting closer now to what is this thing called responsible robotics, but still that can be quite abstract from what I've said so far. So we have to be clear about, okay, well, who is responsible and what is it that they're responsible for? And the reason why we need to have this clarity is because, you know, Frank brought up this morning the problem of many hands idea. And it was also, I think Sophie touched on this too, responsibility attribution. There's so many players involved. Where are we going with this? And so what we need to do in the robotic space is to try and disentangle this break in the chain of responsibility. So to try and shed light or to open the black box of this problem of many hands. So I'm suggesting a way to do that, which is a framework for responsibility attribution. And what this essentially is trying to do is that you start with an ethical issue. And the reason why I say that this framework isn't for uncovering ethical issues is because we already have tools to do that. We have ethical technology assessment tools or checklists. We have value-sensitive design. We have care-centered value-sensitive design. So you can start with a methodology, uncover an ethical issue. And then what we're seeing right now is we have all of these ethical issues, but we don't know what to do with it. And this is meant to fill that gap. Begin with the ethical issue, and now let's scope who are the possible, the potential relevant candidates for responsibility attribution. So the conceptual framework is, you know, could go step by step, but this is also meant to be iterative, that all of these steps sort of interact. I suggest that it's important to be very specific about the sector that you're working with. And that's because that can already limit the scope of responsible actors. So if we're talking about the healthcare sector, then we know organizations like the FDA are going to bear certain amounts of responsibility, healthcare practitioners, all of the staff within an institution, insurance companies. So really narrowing in on who possibly could be the responsible agents in this context. The development context is also important because it's important to know that a lot of times, I think we've heard a little bit about this today, that a company could be making a product, but they're not necessarily using the product. They might make and test it, and then it's bought by another company, or it's bought by a university, and it's used in a very different context. So we have to be clear of where the robot is being made and where it's being actually implemented, and then maybe the users are in an entirely different context, because that also helps us identify who could be responsible for the ethical issues that we put on the table. Robot type is also meant to make a distinction between, in certain instances, we might be talking about one robot, the Da Vinci surgical system, for example, and we might want to do an analysis of who is responsible for ensuring data security or ensuring that the implementation and the introduction of the Da Vinci robot is done in a responsible way. We could ask a very specific question like that, and then we'd be looking at Intuitive Surgical, the company who makes the robot, but we could be looking at different companies who actually distribute. So there's a whole web there that happens with just the Da Vinci system. Alternatively, we could look at the class of surgical robots. There's the Da Vinci, the Zeus, the Amadeus. There's multiple robot prototypes that fall in the category of surgical robots. So if we wanted to talk about an ethical issue related to just the introduction of surgical robots and how that evolves or changes the practice of surgery, then we're looking at a wider area of potential candidates for responsibility attribution, and so on and so forth. So you get the idea. So just to put this, just to sort of, explore with one possible case, let's look at e-waste. And so let's think about the idea that we already have a problem with abiding by the treaties that have already been agreed upon, where we're not supposed to be sending our electronic materials to other countries, but we still do it. And robotics is going to follow in the footsteps of this path because we haven't created an alternative one. So we could look at one of the most prominent and pervasive robotic platforms that is used today. This is the Pepper robot. This is SoftBank, Aldebaran. And this robot is bought by other companies, and it's also bought by universities. So a company like Deloitte or a bank or something, Rabobank or ING, those are in the Dutch context, they would buy one of these platforms, and then they would experiment with it in their own company. So you could see one of these robots in the bank, and it greets you as you walk into the bank. Or you could have academics in a university setting. They've bought this robot, and now they're doing experiments with, in a nursing home, how does this robot interact with people? Or working with children, how does this robot interact with people? So if we're talking about this problem of e-waste, and this is not made from any recycled plastics at all, who should be responsible for changing that? Would we ever say that it's the academics who are buying it that bear a certain amount of responsibility? Also, they don't have a choice between prototypes. There isn't another prototype that they could get that's similar to Pepper that has 25% recycled plastics, that could be, has a different sort of degradation process as well, where the company says, you send the robot back to us, we reuse all of the parts, and we make the next generation of robots. That's not a possibility right now. But we certainly wouldn't attribute the responsibility to the academics who are buying it. And as in the same way that we wouldn't tell Deloitte and the banks, you're responsible for the sustainability aspects of this robot because they're not making it. So when you think about this web of who's involved, where the robots are being made, who's using them, then we can start to disentangle or to piece apart different forms of responsibility. It's certainly not just one agent or one group of actors that should be responsible. There's multiple actors here. So if we were to say, well, who could be responsible in this situation, we might say the developers have a forward-looking obligation to start looking into recycled materials, to start considering the degradation of the product. So there's a clear responsibility for the actual developers. But then we could also look to the policymakers and say, well, because of this immediate and urgent problem, perhaps there's also a responsibility on the shoulders of policymakers to start to stimulate sustainable innovation through subsidies, through guidelines or policies that actually require companies are looking into this, whether it's the recycled plastics or whether it's the minerals that are used to create the batteries, to ensure that they come from certified mines. We could also look at the agents who are the implementers of these robots, the academia or other companies, and if there is a moment where there becomes a choice between one sustainable robot and another, maybe they are bearing the burden of a certain sense of responsibility to make a kind of choice, and how can we start to enforce that? We also can't forget about the procurement officers or the procurement agents in this setting. And these are the people who, let's say you're talking about an incubator where you have one huge building and a whole bunch of small robotic startups there. There'll be a procurement officer that helps buy materials, helps buy the platforms that a bunch of different startups will use. Well, they are the sort of gateway to the products. So they have a responsibility then in what products they actually provide or show to their clients. So perhaps the procurement officers also have a sense or should have a kind of responsibility in searching for different alternatives and making sure that they provide the options of different alternatives, all related to this one problem. So in this way, when we take a problem that we can say is known, right, that we know that there is an issue with e-waste, then we can start to disentangle, being very clear about, sectors and how do we actually identify the problem, who could bear certain responsibilities. We can do this, thinking about concepts that are embedded in ethics, responsibility, how do we attribute it. We can then translate this into something that's usable for policymakers in the legal space or in the governance space, but also for engineering teams. This is something that they can start to work with to understand what are the limits within which we or I should be responsible. So moving from problems and identifying problems to actually trying to push forward to creating solutions. And that's it. Thank you.